My name is Julian Reeve. I am 50 years old, and for 12 winters, I photographed a figure standing in the North Sea where no person could stand. 3 nights ago, I enlarged the newest frame and saw my own face looking back from the water. Not a resemblance. My face. The same broken nose, the same scar under the left eye, even the tired fold beside my mouth. People in the village have begun seeing me on the beach when I am locked inside my house. That is why I'm recording this before sunrise. I am not a superstitious man. That is important. I have spent most of my adult life measuring things that other people romanticize. Wing length, nesting success, tidal timing, light angle, migration windows. If a bird changes its route by 40 miles, I want the wind data, not a legend. If a seal vanishes from a haul-out, I look for disease, disturbance, overfishing, not curses whispered in a pub. My work made me patient and dull in the ways science requires. I wait, I record, I compare. I don't believe a thing because it frightened me, and I don't reject it because it shouldn't be there. That habit kept me alive for 50 years. It may also be what invited this. The folder is on the desk in front of me. 12 winters of photographs, all backed up on 2 drives, one sealed in a freezer bag under the loose stone behind the stove. The original cards are in envelopes dated by hand. I used 3 cameras over those years. A Nikon D810, a D850, and the mirrorless body I bought after my eyesight started to trouble me in low light. Different sensors, different lenses, same shoreline, same black reef, same figure, becoming a little less impossible every time I looked. The last file is named like the others. Jan 24 Dunnet East 0631 RAW. Nothing dramatic, just a field code. It was taken at 6:31 in the morning, 3 days ago, with a 600mm lens from the Gorse blind above Hesta Geo. Temperature 2 degrees Celsius, northeasterly wind 18 knots, low tide minus 41 minutes, visibility clear below a shelf of cloud. I know those details because I wrote them before I understood what was in the frame. I have not slept properly since. Yesterday morning, Mrs. Calder from the post office asked why I had been standing by the slip at 5:30 without a coat. I told her she was mistaken. I had been in my kitchen, cleaning salt crust off the tripod feet. She laughed at first, then stopped when she saw my face. She said whoever it was had my walk, not just my height or my jacket. My walk. The stiff right knee from an old fall on St. Kilda. The little pause before I turned my head. Last night, the security camera above my back door recorded me outside the glass at 2:17 a.m. I watched the clip 6 times. The man in the frame stood close enough for the infrared light to flatten his features. But I knew the coat, the shoulders, the shape of the skull. He raised his left hand and placed it against the pane, exactly where I rest mine when I look out at storms. Inside the house, at that same minute, I was sitting in this chair, staring at the sea through the north window. I checked the timestamps against the mains clock, the camera app, and the radio-controlled weather station in the hall. No drift, no duplicate file, no dropped frame. The camera saw something shaped like me while I was inside, and it did not fog the glass with breath. That detail is the one I keep returning to. A human standing that close to a window in January leaves a pale bloom on the pane. This thing left a wet handprint below the lock. Then the mark drained upward, against gravity, in thin threads of salt water. I photographed that print before it dried. The ridges matched mine too closely. There is no one here to help me. My nearest neighbor is almost a mile away. The police would ask about drink, grief, stress. My former colleagues would call it a breakdown. Maybe that is what I would call it if the photographs were not so clean. So I'm going to tell this from the beginning, not because I expect belief. Belief is cheap. Evidence is harder, and I have more evidence than I ever wanted. If you are hearing this before someone else removes it, keep watching carefully. If the archive survives, compare the shoulders first, then the hands, then the face. And if you value stories that don't tidy the world into something safer than it is, leave a like and subscribe before I continue. I am not asking for attention. I am asking for witnesses. I moved to Caithness in 2011, though in truth I had been moving toward it for years. My wife, Mara, used to say I preferred birds because they only demanded accuracy. She died the previous autumn, a sudden cerebral hemorrhage in a supermarket aisle in Inverness, and after the funeral, I discovered that every room in our house had become a kind of accusation. Cups, books, the second pair of boots by the door, ordinary objects arranged around an absence I could not study my way through. The university offered me a reduced teaching load. My doctor offered tablets. Friends offered dinners I could not sit through without feeling my skin tighten. I chose the coast instead. A retired crofter was selling a stone cottage above a narrow inlet east of Dunnet Head, and I bought it with money Mara and I had once set aside for travel. The roof leaked. The wiring was old enough to frighten an electrician. The north wall sweated salt in bad weather. I loved it immediately because it required practical attention and asked nothing about grief. I was still attached to the university then, at least on paper. My specialty was winter behavior in seabirds, especially kittiwakes, fulmars, guillemots, and the shifting feeding patterns that come when water temperature changes by less than a degree. I had published enough to be useful, but not enough to be famous. My better work was photographic, field journals, long lens surveys, identification plates for conservation groups. I knew how animals placed themselves in weather. I knew how distance lies. I knew the difference between a man, a seal, a cormorant opening its wings, and a post made strange by mist. That is why the place mattered. The stretch below my cottage is not a beach in the friendly sense. It is black rock, bladder wrack, broken shelves of sandstone, and channels that fill so fast at flood tide that tourists have been trapped there within minutes. The old people call the reef the Long Teeth. On charts, it is just a hazard mark and a warning about cross currents. At low water, the reef shows as a jagged spine running out from the shore. At high water, it disappears, except for 3 points where the sea lifts and wrinkles over submerged stone. In winter, almost no one goes down there. The wind comes clean across the Pentland Firth and seems to remove thought from the head. Salt freezes on gate latches. Sheep turn their backs to the weather and stand like stones. The sky lowers until the world feels built from 3 colors: pewter, kelp black, and the dead white of bird droppings on cliffs. To me, it was useful. Empty shorelines make clean observations. If a person crossed the frame, I noticed. If an animal hauled out where it should not, I marked it. Repetition was my method and my consolation. My routine barely changed for years. Up before dawn, kettle on, weather station checked, tide tables open beside the sink. I would walk the cliff path with a pack that weighed more than was sensible for a man with a damaged knee. Camera body wrapped in a waxed cloth, long lens, spare batteries kept warm inside my jacket, notebook, thermos, a small radio, and sometimes a flask I pretended was for medicinal reasons. I had 3 hides, one above Hestagio, one near the broken sheep wall, and one lower, down behind a slab of tilted sandstone where I could watch the Long Teeth without being seen from the village road. No one bothered me much. The village accepted me as the birdman, eccentric, solitary, useful when somebody found an injured gannet or wanted to know why gulls were screaming at midnight. If anyone asked whether I was lonely, I lied with the ease of practice. The first winter I lived there, I photographed storms because I did not know what else to do with grief. The second, I began proper surveys again. By the third, my notebooks had regained their old discipline. That discipline is what makes the archive difficult to dismiss. Nothing about the first sighting arrived in a fever or a dream. It arrived in my normal handwriting, between a note about 73 fulmars riding a pressure drop and another about an adult gray seal with net scarring along the muzzle. People imagine strange things announce themselves by breaking the world. They don't. Most of the time, the world remains ordinary and badly lit. A crow lands on a fence post. A man checks his shutter speed because the light is poor. Then, in the corner of a frame, he took for some other reason. Something stands where nothing with a human shape has any right to stand. The first photograph was taken on January 18, 2012, at 7:12 in the morning. I know because the file still carries the original metadata, and the field note still has a smear of coffee across the corner. The tide was low enough to expose the outer shelf, and a slow fog was moving in from the east, the kind that turns distance into guesswork. The birds would not settle. Eiders lifted twice for no clear reason, and the fulmars kept wide of the water below me. My first note reads, "Unusual avoidance of Eastern Channel." I thought maybe an otter was moving through the kelp, or a dead seal was fouling the water. I was in the lower hide behind the sandstone slab. From there, the long teeth are about 480 meters out, depending on the tide. I had the 500mm lens mounted and was shooting at 1/800, ISO 1600, because the light was poor. I was following a black-backed gull when the autofocus hunted, lost the bird, and caught on something vertical near the third break in the reef. A narrow figure, dark against the dull water, standing in the channel with the sea up to the lower chest. The head was small, the shoulders were thin, the arms hung close to the sides. I lowered the camera and looked over the lens, expecting the shape to vanish into the larger pattern of waves and rock. It did not. I remember saying out loud, "You idiot? No one local would go into that channel in January. It is a trap, a hard pull to the north where water funnels between stone shelves." I picked up the radio, then hesitated because the figure was not waving or stumbling. It was simply standing. I took 12 photographs, not because I believed I was seeing anything impossible, but because photographs are useful when memory begins improving a story without permission. The fog thickened. A curtain of gray moved across the channel, and when it passed, the figure was gone. No splash. No movement toward shore. No dark head in the water. Just the reef, the birds still refusing to land, and a patch of sea that looked flatter than the water around it. I waited 20 minutes, then climbed down as far as the tide allowed. The rocks were slick with weed, and twice the swell came over my boots. I found no footprints, no dropped gear, no torn neoprene, no mark where someone might have dragged themselves out. Only winter litter, a detergent bottle, fishing line, crab claws, a dead auk with its eyes gone. Back at the cottage, I loaded the files and prepared to feel foolish. The first 11 frames showed fog, water, and a shape too distant to prove anything. The 12th was sharper. A brief improvement in light had caught the figure cleanly enough to make me lean closer to the screen. The proportions were wrong, not obviously monstrous. That would have been easier. It was wrong in the quiet way that makes the brain keep measuring. The neck was too long. The shoulders sloped too sharply. The arms seemed to reach lower than human arms should. The head had no visible hair, hood, or cap. The face was turned away from me, toward the open water, and the back of it looked smooth, wet and pale where the fog had thinned. I enlarged the image, then stopped because I know how digital noise breeds nonsense. I printed it full size and pinned it above my desk. From across the room, it looked almost ordinary. Up close, it became less ordinary by degrees. That evening, I rang the Coast Guard station at Scrabster and asked whether there had been a swimmer or missing person near Dunnet that morning. There had not. I checked local news for the next week. No body, no rescue, no abandoned vehicle. I wrote unidentified vertical shape on the envelope and placed it with the January cards. 2 weeks later, in nearly the same light, the shape appeared again. This time, I saw it before I raised the camera. It stood at the same point in the channel, chest deep in water, moving hard enough to throw foam against the reef. The birds were gone from the rocks, not scattered. Gone, as if the entire stretch had been emptied. I watched through binoculars until my eyes watered from the wind. The figure did not move. I took 43 photographs before the fog closed and the sea took it from view. When I developed those files, I noticed the first rule. It only appeared when the tide was falling and the wind came from the north or east. Not every time. Not predictably enough to be simple, but often enough to make a pattern. And patterns are dangerous things to give a lonely man. The second appearance should have ended my interest. If something happens twice in a landscape, it is usually because the landscape creates it. A standing wave, a rock exposed at a particular tide, a trick of fog behind kelp stems. I told myself that for most of 2012, spring came, then summer, and the long teeth filled with ordinary life. The figure did not appear once. That absence almost comforted me. By August, I had stopped looking for it, or had taught myself to look without admitting it. When winter returned, I told myself the January thing had belonged to January, the way certain illnesses belong to childhood. On December 9th, it returned. I was working from the higher hide because the lower rocks were iced over. The light was hard and blue, and the sea had the metallic look it gets before snow. At 8:04, the gulls lifted off the reef in a single sheet. I put the binoculars up before I touched the camera. The figure stood in the same channel, not exactly where it had been in January, but close enough that I felt the old irritation rise. This time, the water seemed lower on its body, nearer the waist than the chest, though the tide record later showed the sea level was higher than on the first morning. I photographed it for 7 minutes, 71 frames. It never changed posture. The only movement came from the water breaking against it and sliding around its sides. That detail bothered me first. Water behaves differently around a fixed rock than around a body. Around a rock, the flow tears, folds, and catches. Around this figure, the water divided cleanly, almost gently, as if unwilling to strike it. That winter, I began the catalog. I did not call it that at the time. It was a subfolder named Long Teeth Anomaly. The entries were careful. Date, time, tide height, pressure, wind, lens, distance, visibility, bird behavior, seal behavior, frame count, position, orientation. I included failed watches too. Failure matters. It keeps a pattern honest. By February 2013, I had 5 confirmed sightings. All occurred between late November and early March, within 90 minutes of low tide. Wind north, northeast, or east. Temperature below 6 degrees. Visibility poor to moderate. The figure appeared only when I was alone. That last condition I did not write down at first because it sounded absurd, but it held. Once, a visiting postgraduate named Ewan came to help with a gull count. Conditions were perfect. Nothing appeared. The birds behaved normally. The next morning, with Ewan back in Inverness, every bird left the long teeth at 7:51. The figure rose into view 5 minutes later. It did not walk into frame. It was simply lower, then higher, as if the sea were lifting it into position. I began to test myself. I moved hides. I changed lenses. I set a remote camera on the sheep wall and watched from the cottage. The remote captured nothing. I went down without a camera, pretending to gather plastic from the rocks. The figure did not appear. When I returned the next day with the long lens, it was there before sunrise. That should have frightened me enough to stop. Instead, it made the thing feel like work. Loneliness does not always feel like sadness. Sometimes it feels like purpose, arriving from the wrong direction. The figure had become punctual in a way people were not. It stood in measurable weather. It could be cataloged, compared, understood, perhaps. The photographs changed slowly. In 2012, the figure had been a vertical mark with shoulders. In 2013, the head became more defined. The back of the skull showed a long, smooth slope. The arms hung too close to the body. No clothing, unless the entire body was covered in a dark skin or suit. The animals changed, too. Birds avoided the reef in a widening radius. Gray seals stopped hauling out there on sighting days. Once I watched a young seal approach the channel, lift its head, and reverse so abruptly it rolled sideways. I have seen seals react to orcas with less urgency. By the end of that winter, I had enough material to ask another rational person for help. I did not. I told myself the data set was too small, the images too ambiguous, the risk to my credibility too large. Those were protective facts arranged around cowardice. I kept the photographs private. I kept going back. Each year, I promised myself I only needed one clearer frame, one frame sharp enough to decide whether I was studying an animal, a person, or a defect in my own mind. The sea, patient as always, gave me clarity by degrees. Until then, I could pretend I was studying a shy animal, an optical event, or some human trespasser with a death wish. The figure had always faced either the open water or the reef. If it had a face, I had not seen it. If it knew I existed, it had given no sign. I was in the Hesta Geohide that morning, farther north than usual. A low wall and dead bracken hid the lens. From the water, even with binoculars, I would have been part of the cliff. I tested the angle later. I could not see the hide from the reef. The figure appeared at 7:38. Birds lifted first, as they always did by then. Then the water beside the third break smoothed out, and the dark vertical form rose into position. I took the first frames calmly. Meter the light. Check focus. Record posture. Do not invent meaning. At 7:44, the head turned. It did not turn like a gull noticing movement. It did not snap. It rotated slowly from the open sea toward the cliff until the front of it faced the hide. Through the lens, the face remained vague, a pale oval within the darker outline, but the direction was clear. It was looking exactly where I sat. I stopped breathing with my eyes still against the viewfinder. The autofocus box flickered on the pale face, lost it, found it again. I took 8 frames before my finger came off the shutter. The figure held its position for another minute, then lowered until the water covered the head. I did not leave the hide for almost an hour. Back home, I checked the images with the cold, petty anger of a man hoping to disprove himself. Maybe the head had not turned. Maybe the body had drifted. Maybe my own movement had changed the angle. But the sequence was unmistakable. Frame 219, head away. Frame 220, slight rotation. Frame 221, halfway. Frame 222 onward, facing the cliff. There was no splash, no shift of shoulders, no natural movement that explained it. Only that slow, deliberate turn. After that, I changed locations constantly. I used the lower blind, the sheep wall, the old lime kiln half a mile west. I shot from inside the cottage through a dark upper window. I crouched behind a parked tractor after telling myself I was only going to the shop. Every time the figure appeared, its head eventually turned toward the lens. Not toward me, I thought at first. Toward the lens. That distinction let me keep going. I told myself an animal might detect reflected glass or shutter sound. I bought a sound-dampened housing. I wrapped the lens barrel. I disabled every light. It still turned. Once I triggered the camera remotely from 20 meters away. The figure faced the camera, not the place where I was hidden. That was when the work became private, in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment. I no longer felt like a man observing an unknown subject. I felt like one half of a procedure. The photographs from 2015 show the change clearly. Before February, the head is a smooth, dark mark. After February, the front begins to catch light differently. There are suggestions of hollows where eyes might be, a ridge where a nose would sit, a darker break at the lower face. I know fog and noise can make faces in stone, but these suggestions appeared in sequence, stronger after a day when it had faced the camera. The animals responded as if something had crossed a line. The fulmars stopped nesting on the lower ledges that year. I found 3 dead shags along the tide line in March, all fresh, no obvious injury. I sent one for testing. The report said starvation and exposure. It did not mention why the stomach contained clean sand and nothing else. I began dreaming of the water then, not nightmares, patient dreams. I stood on the reef at low tide, while something in the sea studied me with the care I gave to birds. Sometimes I could not see the watcher, only feel its attention moving over my face, shoulders, hands, the old break in my left ring finger, the right knee that never bent fully. I woke feeling measured. In April, when the sighting stopped for the season, I should have felt relief. Instead, I missed them. That is the part I am most ashamed of. The empty reef felt like a conversation cut off mid-sentence. After Mara died, very few living things had looked for me with persistence. The figure did. It found me behind walls, in dark windows, through fog and distance. That is how obsession dresses itself as evidence. It gives you a notebook, a camera, a reasonable vocabulary. It lets you say catalog when you mean hunger, and field work when you mean need. In the winter of 2016, the figure began to change in ways I could no longer file under posture. The first change was the shoulder line. Mine has never been even. In 1998, I slipped on Hirta with a pack full of camera gear and came down hard on my right side. The collarbone healed badly. In photographs after that, the right shoulder sits a fraction higher and forward. Most people miss it. Mara noticed when I was tired. On January 6th, I opened a series taken at 8:19 and saw the same imbalance in the figure. Left side lower, right side drawn forward. Not exact, I told myself. Not meaningful. A humanoid shape in rough water will seem asymmetrical. I made tea, came back, compared the frame with a photograph Mara took of me years earlier on the Isle of May. The angle of the shoulders was close enough that I closed the laptop. The hands followed. I had broken the ring finger on my left hand during a ringing session in Orkney. A gannet caught me wrong, and the joint never fully straightened. When I hold the camera, that finger curls away from the barrel. In February, one clear frame showed the figure's left hand by its thigh. 4 digits were visible. The 4th bent inward at the same wrong angle as mine. That night, I printed the image, put it beside my hand, and stared until I hated myself. It could have been weed, compression, a wave cutting across the fingers. I wrote all 3 explanations in the notebook. Then I wrote, nevertheless. The word frightened me more than the picture. By then, the archive was too large to ignore and too strange to share. I had 12,000 images connected to the long teeth. A few hundred showed the figure. 43 were clean enough to compare. I arranged them by year across the dining table. Outline, head, shoulder height, arm length, hand position, apparent gaze. In early frames, the figure looked generic, a human idea rather than a human body. By 2014, it had acquired a habitual stillness that resembled mine in the field. By 2015, it faced the lens. By 2016, it held itself with my injuries. I began checking for other sources. Had someone photographed me on the cliffs and projected the image? Was a local playing some cruel game. I searched forums and tourist photographs tagged near Dunnet Head. I found myself in strangers' backgrounds, a dark man with a long lens, but nothing that explained the changes. No diver could stand in that channel for years. No costume could make birds leave before it appeared. I considered the ugliest possibility, that I was editing the photographs and forgetting. Sleep deprivation, grief, alcohol, neurological disease. I stopped drinking. I left memory cards sealed in numbered envelopes after each watch. I asked a lab in Aberdeen to inspect 3 raw files without context. The technician wrote back that there was no obvious manipulation, a distant vertical subject of uncertain origin. That phrase became a refrain. Distant vertical subject of uncertain origin. I wrote it on an envelope. It was the most respectable description anyone had given the thing in the water. And the more respectable the words became, the less safe I felt. One morning in March, I filmed instead of shooting stills. The clip lasts 4 minutes and 18 seconds. The figure stands in the channel facing me. Nothing happens until the last 20 seconds, when I lower the camera because my hand has gone numb. My shadow falls across the rock in front of the lens. The figure lowers its head at the same instant. Not a reaction. A matching. My shadow bows. It bows. I watched that clip until dawn. After that, I covered the mirrors in the cottage for a week. I wish I could say I feared seeing the figure behind me. The truth is worse. I feared seeing myself and noticing which details were useful to it. A scar. A habit. The way age had loosened the face, Mara remembered. I caught myself changing my walk, holding my left hand closed as if I could deny it information. But the archive already existed. Thousands of photographs of the coast, and in many of them, my reflection in windows, my shadow on wet stone, my blurred form in the lens hood. I had spent years trying to capture what stood in the sea, and without understanding it, I had filled the record with myself. That is when the thought first came whole. Perhaps it was not approaching me. Perhaps it was being developed. A negative in a tray. A body acquiring contrast. A face assembled through attention. I did not write that down. I was still pretending. The first person I showed was Dr. Helen Markham, who had supervised one of my early papers and still answered my emails. Helen knew seabirds, optics, and the vanity of field men who mistake weather for revelation. I sent 6 cropped images and asked whether she saw a person on the reef. I did not mention the years, the posture, or that the newest frame made my left hand ache. Her reply came 2 days later. Human-shaped, yes. Conclusive, no. Likely telephoto compression, fog, and kelp against wave shadow. She advised caution. I printed the email because I wanted her to be right. The second person was a local photographer named Alistair Mayer, a man with more opinions than tact. I brought him 3 raw files and sat in his garage while he opened them on a calibrated monitor. He enlarged, sharpened, changed contrast, then said, "It's either a man in the water or your camera is inventing one." In that current, I asked. "People are stupid," he said. "Cameras are worse." He laughed, but not comfortably. Before I left, he asked where exactly I had taken the pictures. I lied and gave him a location 2 miles south. The third person wasn't planned. Mrs. Calder saw a print under my arm at the post office when I dropped a parcel. She was 78, small and sharp-eyed. She looked at the dark figure in the gray water and went very still. "Where did you see that?" she said. I told her it was probably nothing. "Then where did you see nothing?" I should have walked away. Instead, I said, "The long teeth." She closed the post office and made tea in the back room. Her father had been assistant keeper at the old light. When she was a girl, men told stories as warnings, disguised as jokes. There were places, she said, where the sea did not return what it took in the same shape. There were faces seen from boats that belonged to drowned men still alive on land. I told her I did not believe in fetches or kelpies. "Good," she said. "Belief feeds the wrong things. Attention feeds worse ones." That sentence stayed with me because she said it without drama. She asked whether I had photographed it. I said yes. She asked whether it had ever turned toward me. I did not answer quickly enough. "Then stop," she said. "Don't give it more of you." I asked what she meant. "Some things out there have no proper face until someone teaches them," she said. Sailors used to cover mirrors on boats after a drowning, not for ghosts, for the water. It learns by reflections, by names, by being looked at too long. It was nonsense. Old coastal folklore, grief and drowning made into rules. But when I returned home, I took down the framed photograph of Mara and me because the glass reflected the north window behind me. That winter, I tried to stop for 16 days. The first week was almost easy. I walked inland. I photographed whooper swans on frozen fields. By the 10th day, I was checking the reef through binoculars. By the 12th, I dreamed of the figure standing incomplete where I had refused to look. On the 16th, low tide came at dawn with a north wind. I lasted until 7:20, then carried the camera to the lower hide. It was there. For the first time, I felt shame before fear. The figure faced the hide from the moment I saw it, as if it had been waiting through my attempt at virtue. The sea was waist high. Its right shoulder sat high. The left hand hung with the ring finger bent. The head tipped slightly right. I took no photographs for almost a minute. I clung to that when I tried to defend myself. I hesitated. Then the fog shifted, the light sharpened, and the old professional reflex took over. I raised the camera. In the first frame after those 16 days, the figure's face had gained a dark mark beneath the left eye. I have a scar there, a small crescent from childhood. It is not visible from a distance unless the light cuts across it. It was visible in my self-portraits, in window reflections, in the photograph on the mantel I had turned to the wall. I went to Mrs. Calder that afternoon with the print folded inside my coat. She would not look at it. She said there were old stories about people who thought they were watching the sea and learned too late that the sea was taking inventory. "Does it want to kill me?" I asked. She shook her head. "Killing is simple. Why would it spend years on simple?" I left angry, but before I reached home, I knew she had given me the first explanation that matched the patience of the thing in the water. In 2018, I stopped trusting my memory and began trusting only the archive. That was when the old photographs became dangerous. Every folder pointed toward the days when the figure stood visibly in the water. During a storm that kept me indoors for 3 days, I sorted the rest of the winter files: gull surveys, reef shots, failed exposures, frames I had never examined beyond focus and species. I was trying to prove the phenomenon had boundaries. I found the opposite. The first hidden appearance was in a photograph from 2011, months before the first official sighting. It was supposed to show purple sandpipers. In the far background, a pale vertical mark stood below the reef, too small to identify, wrong for rock and too high for foam. The date was December 2nd, 2011. I had lived in the cottage for less than a month. Then I found another. Not full figures at first. Suggestions: a head between waves, a shoulder where no shoulder should be, a dark arm aligned with kelp, but not part of it. In some frames, the mark appeared only in reflected water, not in the direct view. On wet stone beneath birds, a pale shape stood upright in reflection, while the sea beyond showed only weather. By dawn, I had 63 possible appearances from ordinary files. By the end of the week, I had 140. It had been present before I knew how to look for it. Unfinished, barely organized, a stain of intention in the weather. I built comparison sheets, direct view, reflection, crop, metadata, field notes. I marked where I stood and where my shadow fell. Then I saw a second pattern. The clearest hidden forms appeared in images that contained some trace of me. My reflection in the cottage window, my shadow across a tide pool, my face distorted in glass. It was learning from whatever the camera carried back. One file nearly ended my work. It was a discarded exposure from 2014, taken inside the cottage after rain. The camera had fired accidentally from my shoulder. The frame showed the hallway floor, my boots, a mirror, and the north window. In that dark window, behind my reflected legs, stood a thin, pale outline. Not outside. In the reflection. It occupied the place where my upper body should have continued. I took the mirror down and broke it in the yard with a hammer. Then I widened the search beyond my archive. I visited the local history room in Thurso and asked for photographs of the old light, fishing crews, storm damage, anything showing the long teeth. The volunteer gave me boxes no one had digitized properly. A few carried marks I now knew how to read. A 1976 photograph of two boys with a cod showed, behind them in a puddle, a narrow face looking up from reflected sky. A 1959 image of wreckage showed three pale uprights in the surf. A glass plate from around 1903 showed a shape like a person still deciding how many limbs it needed. I found names, too. A crofter in 1938 claimed to see his brother below the cliff 2 days after the brother boarded a train to Glasgow. A schoolteacher in 1964 wrote that the postman knocked at her window at midnight while the real postman was in hospital. A fisherman named Andrew Sutherland disappeared in 1982 after telling men at the harbor that something in the tide pools had his mouth. I copied everything. I told myself I was preserving folklore. The truth was that I wanted company. If other people had seen versions of this, then perhaps I was only the latest fool with better equipment. But none of the old accounts included a sequence like mine. None showed the long development from a mark to a figure to a body with a particular man's injuries. That made my archive intimate. The thing had spent years with me. In the last box at Thurso, I found a photograph from 1921 I cannot explain away. It showed a keeper named Malcolm Reeve, a distant relative, standing near the old light. In the sea behind him, at the long teeth, there was a figure facing shore. The crop was faint, but the shoulder line matched his. Malcolm's left hand had two missing fingers from a rope accident. The figure's left hand ended the same way. Malcolm Reeve drowned that winter. His body was never recovered. I sat in the archive room until the volunteer asked if I was unwell. I said I had found family material. That was true, though not in the way she thought. When I came home, the reef was dark under a rising moon. I did not take a camera outside. For the first time, I understood I was not discovering a creature. I was participating in an inheritance. After Malcolm Reeve, I made the first sensible decision of the entire affair. I packed the main camera body, the long lens, the hard drives, and the field notebooks into plastic boxes and carried them to the loft. I removed memory cards from the smaller cameras. I turned the desk away from the north window. I deleted the tide table app, as if the sea would forget its schedule because I had removed mine. I wish I could say the house became peaceful. It became watchful. Every reflective surface seemed to have acquired patience. The black oven door, the cabinet glass, puddles by the back step. I caught myself moving through rooms with my eyes lowered. A man can make a prison out of precautions very quickly. The figure did not need to appear for the damage to continue. People began mentioning me in places I had not been. Alistair saw me near the harbor before dawn and complained that I had ignored him. I had been asleep. A woman from the next village said I had stood on the old road in heavy rain, facing the sea with no hat. I told her she must have seen another man. Then small things changed at home. My boots were wet one morning, though they had been dry by the stove. The north window latch was opened twice. A smear of salt crossed the hallway floor in a line too narrow for a human footstep and too deliberate for blown rain. I set a trail camera in the kitchen. It recorded nothing but me moving badly through sleepless nights. This is the part that will make some people despise me. I went back because I wanted proof, but also because not knowing had become worse than fear. If the thing was copying me, I needed to see how far it had progressed. If it already had enough, perhaps nothing would help. Every version of the question led to the reef at winter low tide. I took the equipment down from the loft on January 21st, 2020. I cleaned the sensor. I charged every battery. I changed nothing, allowing the system to remain exactly as it had been during previous sightings. A controlled condition. Even then I was dressing surrender as method. Before dawn, I wrote a note to Helen Markham. Not a confession, a failsafe. If anything happened to me, she should examine the drive labeled Rookery Accounts, which was not about rookeries. I hid the password in a sentence about Mara's birthday. I scheduled it to send in 30 days, then stared at the cancel button. The ground was iron hard with frost. The sea made no dramatic sound, only its usual grinding against stone. The sky held a pale band above the horizon. I set the tripod with hands that did not shake until I tried to lock the head. The long teeth were emerging from the falling tide. Birds moved in restless loops, but would not land. At 6:37, the water beside the third break went smooth. I knew before the figure rose that it would be there. That knowledge sickened me. It had become a ritual, and rituals do not require belief. The figure appeared slowly, water sliding down a narrow, dark body. It stood higher than before, waist deep. The chest was not muscular, not skeletal, simply more particular. The shoulders were mine. The hands were mine. The head turned to me without delay. I did not photograph immediately. Through the lens I felt, for the first time, that it was also waiting for restraint. The face was still indistinct, but there were planes now. Brow, cheek, a recess where the mouth would be. It held its left hand slightly away from the thigh, the bent finger visible. Then it made a movement so small, I nearly missed it. It touched the scar below its left eye. No wave could do that. No weed. No coincidence of light. A long, dark finger rose, paused beneath the pale mark, and lowered. The gesture was not threatening. It was almost instructional, as if it were showing me what it had learned. I took 286 photographs. There is no noble version of that sentence. I knew Mrs. Calder's warning. I knew the archive's pattern. I knew each frame might be giving it more of me. I took them anyway, because the camera was the only language we shared, and because some ruined part of me wanted to be understood. When I returned home, my scheduled email to Helen had been sent. I had not touched the laptop. The send date still read February 20th, but the sent folder showed 7:02 that morning while I was on the cliff. The message contained one added line I did not write. If he denies the water, ask the water which one of us came first. That was when I finally stopped thinking of the figure as an animal. Helen called after the email sent. On the third call, I answered and lied badly enough that she knew something was wrong. She wanted the drive. She wanted me away from the house. She said words like stress response, intruder, police. "Julian," she said, "what does ask the water mean?" I nearly told her everything. Then the line filled with a sound like breath moving through a flooded room, and the call dropped. Before she could arrive, I made the final series. I know how that sounds. A man with evidence, warnings, and a friend coming to help chooses to go back alone. But people had seen my shape away from me. My email had been altered. If I left, I might leave an almost finished version of myself on the shore with no one knowing how to tell us apart. The tide was lower than predicted. The long teeth showed black and wet under a sky without color. There were no birds at all. I took the 600mm lens, the mirrorless body, a backup audio recorder, and a cheap instant camera. I wanted one image that did not pass through software. It stood closer to shore, no longer at the third break, but in the inner channel. That location was impossible in a new way. The channel is not chest deep at that tide. It is either ankle water, over rock, or a violent drop. The figure occupied the drop without being moved. I set the tripod. My hands were calm. Some part of me had accepted the procedure. Camera to plate, eye to lens, subject to archive. Through the viewfinder, the face was blurred by distance and sea haze, but the body was clear. It wore no clothes. The surface was dark gray where water covered it, paler above, slick and without droplets. My shoulders, arms, my left hand, ring finger bent. My right knee's inward angle, though knees should not have been visible. The head tipped exactly as mine tips when I listen. Then it raised an object from the water. For one mad second, I thought it was holding a fish. Then the shape resolved. A camera. Not my camera, not any model I recognized, but something arranged like one. A black box of shell-smooth material, a circular opening where a lens should be. It photographed me. There was no flash, no click I could hear above the sea, but I felt the act with sick certainty. It had learned not only my injuries and face, but my method. I had believed the camera made me the observer. Now it placed me on the other side of the exchange. I fired the shutter. The first 100 frames show the figure holding the object to its face. In frame 117, it lowers it. In frame 118, the light changes only around the face, as if the skin there had become a surface waiting for detail. In frame 126, the mouth is visible. Thin, downturned. Mine. In frame 133, the nose has my old break. In frame 141, a crescent shadow forms beneath the left eye. I took the instant camera and made 3 prints. They developed in my coat pocket while I kept shooting. I needed to know whether the transformation belonged to the screen. The first print showed a pale oval. The second, a face almost human. The third, me. Not perfectly. That would come later. The skin was wrong, too smooth and wet. The eyes were too flat, as if depth had been copied without life. But the structure was mine. Anyone who knew me at a distance would have said Julian Reeve was standing in the North Sea, staring back at himself. At 7:03, it smiled. I have never had a generous smile. Mara used to tease me for looking apologetic when happy. The expression on the thing's face was my restrained, awkward, half-formed smile, stripped of any warmth. Then its mouth opened. I heard my own voice come from the water. Not loud. A dry, practicing sound. Then one sentence, carried thinly over the channel. Human-shaped, yes. Conclusive, no. Helen's email. My voice reading Helen's words. I ran then. I left the tripod standing. Halfway up the path, I fell and tore my palm on stone. When I looked back, it had not followed. It stood beside my camera, one hand resting on the lens hood as I often rested mine, and watched me leave as if the necessary work had been completed. At home, the final digital files were already on the laptop, camera still on Cliff. The memory card should have been inside it. Yet the folder sat on my desktop, named in my system, with one new file at the end. It wasn't a photograph of the sea. It was my kitchen, shot from outside the north window. I was in the image, or something shaped like me was. It stood inside the room, looking at the empty chair where I am sitting now. Helen arrived at 3:40 and found me at the kitchen table with the instant print under a mug. I had not phoned the police, packed, or washed the blood from my palm. Shock makes men practical in stupid ways. I had labeled the audio file and forgotten my tea. She did not believe me at first. I would not have either. Then I showed her the archive in sequence, year after year of the same water, the same reef, the same figure acquiring my posture, injuries, and face. Watching her go silent frightened me more than if she had laughed. At 5:12, while she copied the files, someone knocked on the back door. 3 slow knocks. My rhythm, 2 close, one after a pause, because my right hand stiffens in cold. The glass had gone gray with evening. A figure stood beyond it in my dark field coat. "Don't answer," I said. It raised its left hand to the pane, the ring finger bent inward. Water ran down the glass, though no rain was falling. Helen lifted her phone to record. It tilted its head toward the phone. Then it spoke through the door in my voice. "Helen, open it." He's confused. Fear, yes, but also shame. It had caught my voice. Not perfectly. The vowels were damp, and the breath came at the wrong places, but the shape was mine. Reasonable, embarrassed, persuasive. Helen did not move. The figure smiled my small, apologetic smile. Its face pressed close enough to the glass for the security light to catch it. She saw what I had seen. Not a monster, but a careful copy with errors hidden where strangers would not look. We found no footprints, only a wet path across the stones. The door camera had recorded 12 minutes. On the footage, the face improved while we watched. At first it was smooth. By the end, the eyes had deepened and the mouth had learned where to rest. I almost let her take me away from the coast, to any lit room where people could agree on one version of me. But as we loaded her car, Mrs. Calder appeared at the gate. She said the man from my house had passed her on the lane, walking toward the shore with Helen's exact stride. Helen dropped her keys. We did not leave by road. Helen drove inland across farm tracks she knew from survey work. At her insistence, I recorded statements on her phone, mine, and the audio recorder. We split the drives. She took 2. I kept 1. She would upload the archive far from the coast. I would not return. There is no defense except the truth. The thing had my house, my coat, my voice, and enough of my life to keep using them. If I vanished inland, what remained here would become the accepted Julian Reeve. People are authenticated by habit, paperwork, neighbors, old coats, familiar walks. A copy only needs to be present where the original is absent. The cottage door was open when I arrived. Inside, the air smelled of kelp and cold iron. My photographs had been turned toward the north window. Mara's picture stood on the table. The glass was wet. Behind my reflected face, another face hovered in alignment. Outside, the sea was moving toward low tide. On the long teeth stood not one figure, but 3. One was mine. One had Helen's height and sharp shoulders. The third was smaller, incomplete, with no finished head. They faced the shore without motion. I had been an aperture, a camera turned toward the land. I am recording this from the cottage now because I do not think leaving will help. Helen has the archive. If she is alive and still herself, she will know what to do with it. The drive behind my stove contains everything from 2011 onward. If this house is found empty, do not trust the man who returns from the beach claiming exhaustion. Ask something the sea could not learn from photographs. The tide will be low in 20 minutes. I can see the figures without the lens. Mine is closest to shore. It has my coat over one arm. It is patient. I used to think the worst thing the ocean could do was take a person and leave nothing behind. I was wrong. The ocean can leave almost everything behind. A face, a voice, a walk, enough memory to pass in poor light. If this recording reaches you, watch people who come back from the water, changed in ways everyone calls grief or age. Do not stare too long at shapes in the tide. Do not give a lens to something looking back. And if this confession held you here, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what makes a person real. The body others recognize, the memories no camera can steal, or the fact that someone saw them first and called them by name.